On December 5th, 1872, Captain David Morehouse came on deck of his Canadian Brigantine, the Dei Gratia, and his helmsman pointed out a ship in the distance heading towards them. But something wasn't quite right about this ship. It was moving around erratically in the water, and the sails were damaged and set weirdly, so Captain Morehouse began to suspect that something was wrong. As the ship came closer to them, Morehouse couldn't see any crew members on deck and he got no reply to his hand signals, so he sent his first mate Oliver DeVoe and his second mate John Wright in a little lifeboat to go investigate. As DeVoe and Wright got closer, they were able to read the ship's name on her stern. The ship was the Mary Celeste, and when they climbed on board, they would find that the ship was completely abandoned, but all of its cargo and crew's personal belongings were left behind. Now, if this was a silly Pixar movie, this is about the time you would get that classic freeze frame and the, "Hey, I'm Mary Celeste, and you're probably wondering how I got into this mess." Unfortunately, this is not a silly Pixar movie and the ship can't talk, so nobody actually knows what happened. And so, this has become one of the biggest maritime mysteries of all time. It's even been called the greatest mystery of the sea. So what I've done is I've summarized the story and I've compiled a few theories about what could have possibly happened. Some theories are pretty good, some are pretty shit. Now for everyone unfamiliar with the story of the Mary Celeste, here we go. The Mary Celeste was a Canadian brigantine built at Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, and registered as the Amazon in Passborough, Nova Scotia in 1861. That's awesome, because we now know that this story is actually real. Unlike the SS Orang Medan story that you would no doubt hear from true scary story YouTubers that only tell true scary stories apparently. Now just to avoid any confusion, firstly, I am South African and I speak South African English, so I'll probably mispronounce a lot of words in this video. Secondly, I'll be referring to this ship by whatever name it had at the time, because the Amazon was later bought and then renamed to the Mary Celeste in 1868, and then 4 years later it would be found abandoned. But before we get there, let's cover a couple of highlights of this ship's career, because people back then, and probably still today, actually believed that this ship was cursed, which is one of the purported reasons that it was deliberately run aground and abandoned again, once and for all, in 1885. Although I doubt that very much because it sounds to me pretty clearly that it was an insurance scam, but maybe this was the one ship in history that actually was cursed. And fortunately for us, there actually is a ship instrument that allows us to measure if a ship is cursed. You may be familiar with some of these standard ship instruments, a thermometer, a barometer, a speedometer. Well, let me introduce you to the shitometer, which, as the name suggests, measures how much shit has happened to a ship in its lifespan in order for us to tell if it's cursed or not. Just to let you know how it works, the shitometer tallies up general emergencies, collisions, and lives lost. So at the very least in this video, we will solve once and for all with our shitometer if the Mary Celeste was actually cursed or not. And since I know the rest of the script, I'll just let you know now that the final shitometer reading is nothing compared to the sinking of the German refugee ship the MV Wilhelm Gustloff in 1945, which has a score of over 9,000, because that's how many people died when the torpedo hit that ship. The Mary Celeste is not even close to the Titanic, which has a score of over 1,500, because again, that's how many people died. But no one considers those ships cursed. So I guess the paranormal can only work on a minute, microscopic, non-threatening, non-deadly scale. But hey, this is not a competition or a paranormal debunking video. This is just a video about what could have possibly happened to the maybe cursed Mary Celeste. Alright, we've faffed about enough, let's get into it now. For the Amazon's maiden voyage in June 1961, they debarked from Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, and set sail for Five Islands, Nova Scotia, where they would collect a cargo of wood to take across the Atlantic Ocean to London. After supervising the ship's loading, the Amazon's first captain, a guy named Captain McClellan, became sick and just kept getting worse and worse. The Amazon eventually decided that it had to turn around and return to Spencer's Island, but it was probably already too late, because Captain McClellan would die from this illness once the ship got back to Spencer's Island on June 19, 1861. Now I know it's not the ship's fault, we're just keeping track of all the shitty things that happened around the Mary Celeste. Now after McClellan died, a guy named John Nutting Parker took over as captain and he resumed the voyage to London. Now Nutjob Parker must have been new at this whole captain thing, because he would steer the Amazon into some fishing equipment in the Narrows of Eastport, Maine. and after leaving London, he ran into and sank another brig in the English Channel. Now, it doesn't appear that anyone died in this accident, and I couldn't find the disaster listed anywhere, so I have no idea what happened. But I thought for sure that after smashing some fishing equipment and literally sinking another ship, that the owners of the Amazon would tell John Nutting Parker to fuck off and go back to scrubbing decks and shit. But it appears that the owners of the Amazon did nothing about these collisions. What a clever joke that was. Now, John Nutting Parker remained in command for another 2 years, and during this time, the Amazon worked mainly in the West Indies trade. Then in 1863, Nutjob Parker was succeeded by a captain named William Thompson, who remained in command until 1867. While Thompson was in command, nothing really unusual happened either, except that in October 1867, at Cape Breton Island, the Amazon was driven ashore in a storm and was so badly damaged that the owners abandoned her as a wreck. Poor cursed Mary Celeste. Later that October, the Amazon was bought as a derelict by a guy named Alexander McBean, and within a month, Bean sold the wreck to a local businessman who sold the Amazon in November 1868 to a guy named Richard W. Haynes. Now, Richard Haynes was a mariner from New York and paid about $1,750 for the wreckage, and then spent $8,825 to repair it. He then made himself the captain, and then about a month later in December, he re-registered the ship in New York and changed the name to the Mary Celeste. Then it was all sunshine and rainbows until about a year later in October 1869, when the ship was seized by Haynes' creditors and then sold to a New York consortium led by a guy named James H. Winchester. Now, all these names I've mentioned previously, you can feel free to forget them if you want, but James Winchester will be a recurring character, so remember his name at least. Now, for the next 3 years after Winchester bought this ship, no one really knows what the fuck was going on with the Mary Celeste, so we'll skip ahead to early 1872. At this point, the Mary Celeste went through a major refit which cost about $10,000 and increased the ship's size by like 4 or 5 feet in all directions. $10,000 then is like $250,000 today, so totally worth it, I'm sure. Eventually, the Mary Celeste was ready once again to go out and transport cargo, and this consortium that owned it was still led by James Winchester. Now, obviously, a cargo ship is a business, and James Winchester held about 6 shares in this business. He was joined by 2 minor investors who held 1 share apiece, and the remaining 4 shares were held by the Mary Celeste's new captain, Benjamin Spooner Briggs. The Mary Celeste's next victim. Now, Benjamin Briggs was born to a family of seafarers in Massachusetts in 1835. His father, Nathan Briggs, was a sea captain, and 3 of his 4 brothers also worked at sea, one of them even also becoming a sea captain. The point of all of this information is to let us know that Captain Briggs knew his shit when it came to the sea. He also seemed like a pretty solid dude. People liked him, he had a good reputation, he was an observant Christian who read the Bible regularly and was said to often bear witness to his faith at prayer meetings. To be honest though, I don't really know what that means. The tragedy, of course, is that this is a real guy with a real family. In 1862, he married his cousin, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb. His cousin, Sarah Elizabeth Cobb. They had 2 children together. Their son Arthur was born in 1865, and their daughter Sophia was born in 1870. His cousin. I suppose it could have been normal back then. We are not here to talk about cousins. We are here to talk about the Mary Celeste. Now, by the time his daughter Sophia... his cousin. By the time Sophia was born, Benny Spooner Briggs had earned his reputation as a sea captain and was considering retirement. An amazing idea, by the way. I am so glad that I hung up my old peg leg and eye patch and called it a day after 8 years of working on cruise ships. Before taking command of the Mary Celeste, Briggs was planning on going into business with his seafarer brother Oliver, who had also gotten over ship life. And I don't fucking blame him, it's tedious. It's not really relevant to the story, but these ship companies, they try to brainwash you and say, oh, this is the best job you'll ever have, you'll see the world. But then you just keep getting assigned to these 3 and 4 day booze cruises, and the only place you go to is Nassau in the Bahamas twice a week for 6 months every contract, and you can only really take so much of people puking into their handbags and gambling at Atlantis. To be fair though, I did actually go to more than 100 different countries in my 8 years, so I guess I'm just full of shit. But most of the time, it was Nassau. Anyway, tangent over. Now, Briggs and his brother didn't actually end up going into business together. Instead, they each just invested his savings into a share of a ship. His brother Oliver invested in the Julia A. Hallock, and Benjamin Briggs invested in the Mary Celeste. Then in October 1872, Captain Briggs took command of the Mary Celeste for her first voyage after the massive refit that added just like 4 or 5 feet. And the itinerary was fortunately not Nassau, it was Genoa, Italy. Now Briggs arranged for his cousin his wife Sarah, and his infant daughter Sophia to accompany him, while his son Arthur, who was now in school, was left at home in the care of his grandmother. The next thing Briggs had to do was to pick his crew for the Mary Celeste, and he did this very carefully. Now I'll just show the names of the people that he picked on screen for you. In a letter to his mother shortly before the voyage, Briggs said that he was satisfied with his ship and crew and described his team as peaceable and first-class sailors. Sarah Briggs informed her mother that the crew appeared to be quietly capable, quote, if they continue as they have begun. Now again, the point of all of this information is to let us know that Briggs and his crew knew their shit about the sea. This was an experienced sea captain with a good reputation and his own hand-picked crew. So then what in the blue hell happened here? Well, on October 20th, 1872, Briggs, his crew, and the Mary Celeste arrived at Pier 50 on the East River in New York City to supervise the loading of the ship's cargo. This cargo just happened to be 1,701 barrels of alcohol.
Enough champagne to fill the Nile.
So that's probably what happened. I'll explain later when we get to the top theory. About a week later, Sarah and Sophia joined Briggs on the Mary Celeste, and then on Sunday, November 3rd, Briggs wrote another letter to his mother to say that they were planning to leave on Tuesday, adding, quote, our vessel is in beautiful trim and I hope we shall have fine passage. Hope! We had a saying on board. Hope is not a strategy. Anyway, on the morning of Tuesday, November 5th, the Mary Celeste left Pier 50 with Briggs, his family, and the 7 crew members, and they moved into the New York harbor. As of course is tradition in Unsolved Mysteries, the weather was pretty shit, but Big Brain Briggs actually made a good decision and decided to wait for better conditions. Amazing! This has never happened before, so for that reason alone, Captain Benjamin Spoony Briggs gets the Mystorian's official pap of approval. Well done, sir. Briggs decided to anchor the ship just off Staten Island, close to where Ed Warren saw his shipmates getting eaten by sharks, and Briggs's cousin Sarah, his wife, used this delay to send one final letter to her mother-in-law. I guess that would make it her aunt, saying, quote, tell Arthur I make great dependence on the letters I shall get from him, and will try to remember anything that happens on the voyage which he would be pleased to hear. Yeah man, she would never get those letters. It's a pretty sad story. Well, the weather eased about 2 days later on November 7th, and the Mary Celeste would make her departure from the Staten Island harbor and enter the Atlantic Ocean. Now, while the Mary Celeste was sailing off, the Dei Gratia was in Hoboken, New Jersey, loading a shipment of petrol to be taken to Genoa, the same destination as the Mary Celeste, but the Dei Gratia would get there via Gibraltar. The Dei Gratia then departed for Gibraltar on November 15th, so about 8 days after the Mary Celeste, following the same general route the Mary Celeste would have taken. And everything was sunshine and rainbows until about 20 days later on December 5th, 1872, when the Dei Gratia was about midway between the Azores and the coast of Portugal. Captain Morehouse would then come up on deck and his helmsman pointed out the Mary Celeste. And now we are all caught up. Morehouse then of course sends his first mate Oliver DeVoe and his second mate John Wright to go investigate the ship. They board the Mary Celeste and they find that the ship is completely abandoned. However, all of the crew's belongings and those 1,701 barrels of alcohol are still on board. So after seeing this, Oliver DeVoe turns to John Wright and says, quote, John, what in the blue hell happened here? John Wright replies, how the fuck am I supposed to know? I was on the Dei Gratia with you. DeVoe then says fair enough, and they keep looking around. Now fortunately, these guys gave a very detailed description of what they saw. They also managed to get the ship back to port so people could come on board and investigate it, and these details and clues are what people have used to try to piece together what probably happened. Now when DeVoe and Wright boarded, they said that the sails were partly set and in poor condition, some missing altogether, and much of the rigging was damaged, with ropes hanging loosely over the sides. The main hatch cover on the brig was secure, but the fore and lazarette hatches were open, their covers beside them on the deck. Now these hatch covers are what kept the brigantine's cargo safe from water and also the ship itself from taking in too much water, which as we know, can cause a ship to sink. But the Mary Celeste was actually still fine and seaworthy, it was still floating in the water, despite the fact that there was about 3.5 feet or 1.1 meters of water in the hold. Very interestingly, DeVoe and Wright found a makeshift sounding rod, which is a device for measuring the amount of water in the hold, and they found this sounding rod abandoned on the deck. They also noticed that the ship's only lifeboat, which was a small yawl that had apparently been stowed across the main hatch, was missing. And the binnacle, which is like a little stand that keeps some of the ship's navigation equipment safe that the helmsman used, had shifted from its place and its glass cover was broken. They then went and inspected the crew quarters and found the ship's daily log in the mate's cabin. The last entry was dated at 8 AM on November 25th, 9 days earlier. The logbook recorded the Mary Celeste's position at that time as just off the Santa Maria Island in the Azores, nearly 400 nautical miles or 740 kilometers away from the point where the Dei Gratia ran into the Mary Celeste. DeVoe noted that the cabin interiors were wet and untidy from water that had entered through the doorways and skylights, but otherwise, everything was in reasonable order. He also found personal items scattered all about Briggs's cabin, including a sheathed sword under the bed. But where shit gets weird is that most of the ship's papers regarding the cargo was missing, along with the captain's navigational instruments. Otherwise, again, everything was in reasonable order, considering the circumstances. The galley equipment was neatly stowed away, there was no food prepared or under preparation, and there were still loads of provisions in the stores. DeVoe and Wright had no fucking idea what happened. There was no obvious signs of fire or violence, it just appeared that the crew abandoned ship in the small yawl for reasons unknown. DeVoe and Wright then returned to the Dei Gratia to report these findings to Captain Morehouse. Morehouse then decided that they should bring the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar, so he ordered half of his crew to go and captain it. Now, the reason that they did this might not be entirely just because they're good guys or whatever. Bringing in derelict ships like this can actually make you a shitload of money. Morehouse and his crew then agreed that they would split the spoils. DeVoe and 2 experienced seamen were sent over to the Mary Celeste, while Morehouse and 4 of his crew remained on the Dei Gratia. Now, the weather was relatively calm for most of the way to Gibraltar, but since each ship was so undermanned, it took quite a lot longer to get there. The Dei Gratia reached Gibraltar on December 12th, but the Mary Celeste had encountered fog and arrived the following morning. So as you can see, the Mary Celeste was not at any kind of risk of sinking and was still able to travel over 1,000 kilometers to land. So naturally, this made people wonder just what the fuck happened to the crew then. When the Mary Celeste docked at Gibraltar, it was immediately impounded by the Vice Admiralty Court to prepare for salvage hearings. DeVoe then wrote to his wife about this experience and said, quote, "I can hardly tell what I am made of, but I do not care so long as I got in safe. I shall be well paid for the Mary Celeste." Now, the next thing that happened was there was a bunch of salvage court hearings about the Mary Celeste, and these hearings were conducted by a guy named Frederick Solly Flood. Now, Flood, oh my god, Flood was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, and was described as a man whose arrogance and pomposity were inversely proportional to his IQ, and the sort of man who, once he made his mind up about something, couldn't be shifted. So Solly Flood is one of those guys. Kinda sounds like those Roswell UFO believers. Moses, have you seen the comments on this video? You cherry-pick details to suit your narrative. Well, sorry, I didn't think the alien bodies people apparently saw getting stretched away was relevant because the person who found and described the wreckage didn't mention bodies. But okay, whatever. Now, since it's obviously not obvious to you, let me just remind you that you are able to believe whatever the fuck you want. And if you want to believe that the 250-pound parachute test dummies that the military launched in the 1950s are the little green aliens who crashed their spaceship made of tinfoil and sticks in 1947, go ahead. Since I'm already on this tangent, don't you think it's weird that UFOs don't crash anymore? Kinda like how human aircraft don't crash that much anymore. Anyway, we are here to talk about the Mary Celeste. So basically, this Flood guy's an idiot, and after hearing DeVoe and Wright's testimony, he comes to the unshakable conclusion that a murder happened on board the Mary Celeste. This conclusion was then kinda sorta regurgitated by the New York Shipping and Commercial List, which was an old publication and trade newspaper on maritime stuff, and on December 21st, 1872, they said, quote, "The inference is that there had been foul play somewhere, and that alcohol is at the bottom of it.
And enough champagne to fill the Nile."
So then, on December 23rd, Flood ordered an examination of the Mary Celeste, after he already made all of these fucking claims. But this examination was carried out by a guy named John Austin, the surveyor of shipping, with the assistance of a diver named Ricardo Portanato. John Austin noted cuts on each side of the bow, caused, he thought, by a sharp instrument, and he found possible traces of blood on Briggs's sword. Now, his report emphasized that the ship did not appear to have been struck by heavy weather, citing that a vial of sewing machine oil was found upright in its place. Now, talk about cherry-picking shit to suit your narrative. Because this John Austin guy just completely forgot that 3 guys from the Dei Gratia sailed the Mary Celeste over 1,000 kilometers to Gibraltar.
Oh, $1.
It just did not fucking occur to them that somebody could have just put that shit upright again. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to deduce that there must have been some kind of bad weather because there was more than a meter of water in the hold. Otherwise, how the fuck could it have gotten in there? But yeah, Solly Flood and the court just completely forgot about all of that and just thought that murder sounded a little better. Then Austin's diver guy Ricardo went down and inspected the hull and concluded that the ship didn't collide with anything or run aground. A further inspection by a group of Royal Naval captains agreed with Austin's opinion that the cuts on the bow had been caused deliberately. They also found stains on one of the ship's rails that might have been blood, together with a deep mark possibly caused by an axe. Now, these findings just further strengthened Solly Flood's belief that this was a murder. Now, the next thing that seems to have happened is that Solly Flood had some sort of delusion that he was the detective in some kind of Agatha Christie novel, and this was his great denouement, which is the part where the detective unveils the killer, explains their motive, and ties everything together.
My red diamond.
A dramatic, passionate, and colorful crime for a fashionista, Miss Birdie J. Unfortunately, this crime clashed with the presence of
Frederick Solly Flood. And this is what Solly Flood said. The crew of the Mary Celeste had got at the alcohol and murdered the Briggs family and the ship's officers in a drunken frenzy.
Very good, very good.
They had cut the bows to simulate a collision, then fled in the yawl to suffer an unknown fate. Flood then thought that Morehouse and his men were hiding something as well, specifically that the Mary Celeste had been abandoned in a more easterly location and that the log had been doctored. He could not accept that the Mary Celeste could have traveled so far while uncrewed, something, by the way, which is actually very possible due to things like ocean currents. Obviously, Flood couldn't exactly prove this, so nothing really happened. Then on January 15th, James Winchester arrived in Gibraltar to ask when his ship, the Mary Celeste, might be released again to deliver the cargo. Now, the Solly Flood motherfucker must have just been paranoid, because he also thought that James Winchester encouraged the crew to kill Biggs and the officers in some sort of conspiracy. So, Flood then demanded a surety of $15,000 from Winchester, I guess so that Winchester couldn't just run off after he released the ship. But unfortunately, Winchester didn't have $15,000. Probably because he just spent $10,000 on making the Mary Celeste fall 5 feet longer. Now, what sort of benefit would Winchester get out of his cargo not being delivered just after investing $10,000 in the ship? Who knows? However, Winchester testified to Briggs's character and his reputation as captain, and said that Briggs would never have just abandoned ship unless it was absolutely necessary. And that makes sense. He had his family on board with him, and whatever choice he made, he probably thought that it was the best one. Anyway though, to the surprise of no one, Flood's denouement was proven incorrect by science, bitch!
Yes, science!
Analysis of the stains found on the sword and elsewhere on the ship showed that they were not blood. Then another captain from the US Navy showed up named Captain Schufelt and said that, in his professional opinion, Solly Flood is full of shit and the marks on the bow were not man-made, but came from the natural actions of the sea on the ship's timbers. Well, now that Solly Flood looked like a complete fucking idiot, he reluctantly released the Mary Celeste from the court's jurisdiction on February 25th, and no one really came to a solid conclusion about what actually happened to the Mary Celeste's crew. Not only that, but the salvage payment was only £1,700, far less than Captain Morehouse and his crew thought that they would be getting for such a dangerous task. And one final shitty thing for the shitometer: since Captain Morehouse stayed in Gibraltar to attend these hearings and instructed his first mate DeVoe with delivering that cargo of petrol, he was criticized heavily. So everything just sort of fell apart for everyone involved. Then sometime in early March 1873, the Mary Celeste set sail again for Genoa with a new captain, Captain George Blatchford. They arrived in Genoa on June 26th, and after leaving Genoa, they arrived back home in New York on September 19th. So pretty smooth sailing. But because of the Solly Flood guy and the Gibraltar hearings, newspaper stories of bloodshed and murder ruined the Mary Celeste's reputation, and nobody wanted to hire the ship to transport their cargo. And as you can imagine, if nobody wants to hire you, you are not making money. So in February 1874, James Winchester and his consortium sold the Mary Celeste. For, by the way, a massive fucking loss to a partnership of New York businessmen. Once the ownership had been transferred, the Mary Celeste sailed mainly in the West Indian and Indian Ocean routes, and just fucking bled money. People didn't care that there was a new owner, they still didn't want to hire this ship. And not only was it bleeding money, but in February 1879, the ship was reported at the island of St. Helena, where the crew called for medical assistance for the new captain, Edgar Tuffle, who had fallen ill, very much like the first captain of the Mary Celeste, Captain McClellan. And also very much like Captain McClellan, Tuffle would die from this illness. And this is pretty much the point now where people said, yeah, the Mary Celeste is cursed. This is its third captain to die prematurely. 2 from illness, by the way, which had fuck all to do with the ship. But anyway, this ship was then sold again, and again, and again, and again. But ultimately, the damage had been done. It was never going to make money. So its final captain, Captain Gilman C. Parker, no relation to Nutting Parker, I think, conspired with a group of Boston shippers to fill the Mary Celeste with a largely worthless cargo and then misrepresent the value on the ship's manifest. They said on the manifest that this cargo of worthless shit was insured for $30,000 US, which would be anywhere between $750,000 and $1 million today. Then on January 3rd, 1885, Captain Parker deliberately ran the Mary Celeste into a reef at Port-au-Prince, the main port of Haiti. This collision then ripped out the bottom of the Mary Celeste and destroyed it beyond repair. Parker and the crew then rowed themselves ashore, where Parker sold the salvageable cargo for $500 to the American consul, and he then instituted the insurance claims for the alleged value. This story is just fucking crazy, eh? When the consul reported that what Captain Parker had brought was almost worthless, the ship's insurer began an investigation, which quickly revealed that Parker was full of shit and the cargo was overinsured. So, in July 1885, Parker and his co-conspirators were tried for trying to commit insurance fraud. Parker was additionally charged with willfully casting away the ship, a crime known as barratry, which at the time carried the death penalty. Somehow, though, the jury announced that they could not agree on a verdict, and rather than ordering an expensive trial, the judge negotiated an arrangement whereby the defendants withdrew their insurance claims and repaid all that they had received. Along with that, the barratry charge against Parker was deferred, and he was free to go. However, Parker royally fucked up by running the Mary Celeste into that reef, because his reputation was ruined. He couldn't get work, and he died in poverty 3 months later. One of his co-defendants apparently went insane, and another one forfeit the game. Sorry, YouTube just doesn't like that kind of talk. Now, Paul Begg, the author of the book The Mary Celeste, The Greatest Mystery of the Sea, said, quote, "If the court of man could not punish these men, the curse that had deviled the ship since her first skipper Robert McClellan had died on her maiden voyage could reach beyond the vessel's watery grave and exact its own terrible retribution." End quote. Well, that's of course if you believe in curses. I don't. Seems pretty clear to me that Parker chose to run the ship aground, and he paid the ultimate price. Decisions have consequences. Who'd have thought? Well, the only thing we got to do now is take a look at the final shitometer reading to determine whether or not the Mary Celeste was cursed. And coming in with a very generous score of 20, the Mary Celeste has one of the lowest scores for a tragic ship that I have ever seen. It really sucks what happened to all the people. But honestly, when it comes to the maritime industry, this is fairly standard. During my 8 years at sea, every contract you'd hear about a crew member on another ship somewhere who forfeit the game. I was on ships when passengers died mid-cruise, and passengers and crew even fell or jumped off the ship mid-cruise as well. Sometimes they were never found. And there are far too many stories about guests falling off the top deck onto the concrete docks, or dropping their children overboard, or children falling overboard, or even just tragic accidents happening to the crew. I remember on one ship they were doing a drill and they were lowering a lifeboat into the water, and the fucking lifeboat davit snapped and the boat crashed into the water. And sadly, one of the crew members inside the lifeboat was killed in this accident. Unfortunately, the truth is that horrible things happen at sea all the time. Even with all the safety shit in place today, shit still happens. And that's why there's the saying, hope is not a strategy. Even experienced captains and pilots make mistakes. I've seen ships run aground, I've seen ships crash into docks, I've seen ships crash into other ships. Again, unfortunately, the truth is that emergencies, collisions, and deaths at sea are fairly common because the maritime industry is a fairly dangerous industry. Obviously not considering passenger or crew health, there's nothing you can really do about an illness taking somebody's life, but accidents and tragedies do happen from time to time. Did you know that there are an estimated 3 million shipwrecks on the ocean floors? That's gotta tell you something. Well anyway, what a crazy story. Now the obvious question is, what in the blue hell happened to the crew? I doubt that we will ever know for sure what happened to the 10 people who abandoned the Mary Celeste. But a safe guess is that they probably drowned. Because I mean, if there's a meter of water in the hold, then what chance does a small little lifeboat have? But as for why they abandoned the ship in the first place, there's a couple of theories. Let's start out with the least likely and work our way up to the most rational and realistic theory. Theory number 1. They were killed by the crew of the Dei Gratia. Now the reason that this is the least likely theory is because this is another theory from Frederick Solly Flood.
Oh, $1.
Now this guy apparently thought that maybe the Dei Gratia had ambushed the Mary Celeste, somehow lured them onto the Dei Gratia, and then murdered everyone. Now there's just a lot of problems with this hypothesis. There was no sign of violence, the blood they thought was not blood at all, but the biggest issue is that this would have been completely impossible. The Dei Gratia was the slower ship, and had also left 8 days after the Mary Celeste. However, despite the fact that this theory is obviously impossible and complete bullshit, intended just to ruin Morehouse's reputation because Flood may have just been salty about something, the publication, the Quarterly Review, loved this theory. So they published an article on August 29th, 1931, and wrote that Morehouse was sailing under an alias, and he was actually a man of evil repute named Boyce. Now, where the fuck does Boyce come from? Well, in order to explain that, I need to tell you about Theory 2. Sharks. Now, these might just be the same hungry sharks from Ed Warren's Navy disaster story that followed the Mary Celeste all the way from Staten Island. Now, according to Daily Nautica, quote, a diary appeared in 1913 written by a certain Abel Fosdick. Now, Abel Fosdick claimed to be a friend of Captain Briggs and told how he had secretly been smuggled on board the Mary Celeste to escape the American police. Now, according to this fictional character named Abel Fosdick, this is what happened. Captain Briggs bet his crew that he could swim fully dressed, and so he dove into the water to prove his point. The crew were then all standing on the small stage that they had prepared, which overlooked the sea so that his wife and the other sailors could see Briggs swimming. The stage then collapsed, and a pack of starving sharks took care of the rest, while Fosdick, the only survivor, was able to save himself by clinging to a beam until he reached the African coast. The most surprising thing is that there were readers who actually believed this very improbable version of events. Then somebody demonstrated that Abel Fosdick had never existed and that the news was, as we would call it now, fake news, created only to sell a few extra copies of the papers. End quote. Now, this is the story that refers to Morehouse as Boyce. But weirdly, the same thing happens with the Dei Gratia. They come along and they find the Mary Celeste abandoned and they take it to Gibraltar. So I don't understand how it makes him evil or whatever the fuck they said, but yeah, that's the theory and it's a bunch of bullshit. Theory 3. Mutiny, because the crew hit the juice.
Not good. What are you doing? You burned all the food, the shade, the rum.
Yes, the rum is gone.
Why is the rum gone?
1, because it is a vile drink that turns even the most respectable men into complete scoundrels.
Now this one also comes from Solly Flood, so you know that it's wrong already. He thought that the crew got drunk off the alcohol they were carrying, and then killed Briggs, his family, and the officers, and then fucked off on the yawl. When, you know, they they could have just stayed on board the Mary Celeste instead. But fair enough, I guess, alcohol makes you do dumb shit. And yeah, I've seen this firsthand on my 3 and 4 day booze cruises. The lady puked into her handbag and then just kept sitting there like nothing happened. But the fact is this: the crew could not have drunk the alcohol on the Mary Celeste, because the stuff the Mary Celeste was carrying was not rum, it wasn't brandy, it wasn't beer. This was non-potable industrial alcohol. Basically, ethanol.
Why is the rum gone?
It was not 3-4 day party boat juice. Theory number 4, also by Solly Flood: insurance fraud. I'll say one thing about this man at least, he didn't know how to give up, unlike John Cena. Now, according to the Clue Collective, quote, according to Solly Flood, James Winchester, who had a stake of ownership in the Mary Celeste, had assembled a crew specifically for the task of murder. Now let me just interrupt right here. We know that Briggs picked his own crew. Anyway, quote, the reason Solly Flood gave for Winchester's murder plot was insurance fraud. There was also the possibility that the captain of the Dei Gratia and the Mary Celeste had formulated their own insurance fraud conspiracy, in which Captain Briggs disappeared with his share of the cash. A very dramatic mystery indeed, eliciting exactly the huge amount of attention you want when you are carrying out fraud. Even though Solly Flood believed that the Mary Celeste's cargo was overinsured, it wasn't. There was no reason at all to commit fraud. Ironically, in 1885, the new captain did overinsure the cargo and wrecked the Mary Celeste on the coast of Haiti in an actual attempt at insurance fraud. He was caught. You know, I've been wondering, how the fuck did Solly Flood become the Attorney General of Gibraltar? The head of the Gibraltar government law officers? That is the biggest mystery of all here, honestly. Theory number 5, a sea monster. Still a better theory than anything Solly Flood suggested. But here's my advice for people who always say a sea monster did this maritime mystery. Why say sea monster when you could just say cosmic entity that feeds on fear and flesh and then hibernates for 27 years? And that's why we've never seen it. It's just never around, until it is. And as a bonus, it can shapeshift and appear as a giant sea monster. See, if it's a cosmic entity, there are no rules. But a giant fucking living but a giant living kraken on the other hand, would need an impossible amount of food. It would also lack the structural support for its size in the water and leave huge fossils behind, which have never been found. There's a reason that things aren't fucking massive anymore. It's because of natural selection and asteroids, and then they die. But what's even weirder is that giant sea monsters don't attack ships anymore, kinda like how aliens don't crash anymore. Wonder why that is. But it would make a whole lot more sense if it was an incomprehensible cosmic entity, ironically. Just look here. If you compare the Kraken from Pirates of the Caribbean and Pennywise's face, look at how similar they are. I mean, okay, it's not really that similar. But the problem is that people who believe this silly shit are the same people as Solly Flood.
Oh, a dollar!
Their arrogance and pomposity are inversely proportional to their IQ. They've made up their mind about something and nothing could ever convince them otherwise. So, a sea monster ate these people. Well, you're stupid for believing that because it was actually Pennywise and I can prove it. Pennywise, where is Captain Briggs?
What have you done with him?
Oh, I ate him.
See, Pennywise confessed on the record. Mystery solved. Theory number 6, aliens. Theory number 7, pirates. Well, pirates were still active at this time, but nothing was stolen, there was no sign of violence, and it probably wasn't pirates. Theory number 8, ergot poisoning. Finally, a rational theory. It's wrong though, but it's not insane. Now, according to the Daily Nautica again, quote, some have also suggested that the crew have become victims of ergot, the common name for Claviceps purpurea. That word! A sort of fungus that infects bread on board and provokes an intoxication that could lead to hallucinations. In this case, the sailors may have abandoned ship in the throes of who knows what nightmare. Pennywise. Well, here's the problem with this theory. The crew from the Dei Gratia ate the same bread and nothing happened to them. Theory number 9, a natural phenomena. Alright, it's time to get serious again. Going back to what we know, there was about a meter of water in the hold. The water had to get in there somehow. It could have come from rough waves, it could have come from rain, it could have come from a very real and very weird waterspout, which is like a water tornado, I guess. But something must have put the water in the hold, and it's a safe assumption to make that this happened while the crew was still on board because of the sounding rod that was found on the deck by the first mate of the Dei Gratia. Again, a sounding rod was a device for measuring the amount of water in the hold. So the general consensus is that something alarming had to have happened for Briggs to tell everyone to get into the yawl and abandon a safe, seaworthy ship with ample provisions. Oliver DeVoe, the first mate of the Dei Gratia, thought that maybe Briggs abandoned ship after a false sounding because of a malfunction. Perhaps it was the ship's pumps that created a false impression that the vessel was rapidly accumulating water. Now, one of these weird waterspout things could theoretically explain this. I don't really know if rain would be able to fill up the ship so much, but definitely rough waves or a waterspout could. Rough waves or a waterspout could also explain the sails being damaged and the ropes and rigging hanging over the side of the ship, as well as some of the other shit that they found that was broken. Now here's a video showing the life cycle of a waterspout. Hypothetically, if the Mary Celeste was caught in one of these things, the low barometric pressure generated by the spout could have driven water from the bilges up into the pumps, leading the crew to overestimate the amount of water on the Mary Celeste and believe that the ship was in danger of sinking. Hello? What are you thinking about? Now, the counter argument to this is why didn't they steer clear of the waterspout and just go straight through it? These things don't occur instantaneously like lightning. We're also going to have to assume that the theory is referring to a fair weather waterspout, which are the most common ones and are pretty weak and small. They're like 50 meters in diameter. Now, we have to assume it was the weak one because the alternative is an actual fucking tornado, and then there would have probably been a very damaged, very unseaworthy Mary Celeste. So here's the problem I have with the waterspout theory. 50 meters is not that far to sail through anyway, so why the fuck would they have abandoned ship? Especially if they actually were caught in the middle of one of these things. Did they really think that a small lifeboat was a safer choice? I don't know, makes no sense to me. Some other natural phenomena explanations that people have put forward have been icebergs or displaced icebergs, but it's also quite unlikely that a displaced iceberg floated that far, but there was also no evidence that the Mary Celeste hit anything. So unless there was an iceberg and the Mary Celeste hit it and nothing happened, and then the crew were like, oh my god, I've seen that movie The Titanic, we're gonna drown, get into the lifeboat. It makes no sense, the Titanic hadn't even fucking sank yet. Some other people have suggested sea quakes that created enough turbulence on the surface to actually damage the alcohol the Mary Celeste was carrying, releasing fumes. Briggs and the crew could have then thought that maybe there was going to be an explosion, and Briggs ordered everyone to abandon ship. The two displaced hatches found on deck kinda support that the cargo had something to do with the quick escape. Now, why would Briggs and the crew expect an explosion? Well, theory number 10, and the most likely theory: an explosion. Now, a newspaper called the New York World published an article on January 24th, 1886, highlighting a case in which a vessel carrying alcohol had exploded. Since the Mary Celeste was carrying the exact same thing, it's not impossible that the exact same thing happened to them. So again, something had to have happened to get 1 meter of water in the hold. Rough seas, rain, waterspout, whatever. This probably led to the Mary Celeste surging back and forth or listing side to side, and this could have damaged the alcohol stored in the hold. If one of the barrels fell and broke, or even just bumped into other barrels and they opened up, this would have released the gases. The crew could have smelt this, thought, oh fuck, we're gonna explode. This could explain why Briggs ordered the evacuation of the ship. Then while rushing to leave the ship before it exploded, Briggs may have failed to properly secure the yawl to the tow line. This would have obviously kept the lifeboat tethered to the ship. And based on the fact that Briggs grabbed all the ship's papers regarding the cargo and took his navigational equipment, it's reasonable to assume that the plan was to come back to the Mary Celeste, unless, of course, it sank. However, whatever was getting the water into the hold in the first place, be it the rough seas, a waterspout, or rain, or even just the wind, could have pushed the ship away from the crew in the yawl, leaving them to succumb to the elements. Now, I did say that we'll probably never know what happened to the crew, but it's pretty safe to assume that they died in the waters not long after abandoning the ship. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a small boat in relatively calm water, that shit rocks around like crazy. If there are large waves, heavy rains, and a fucking water spout nearby, there's no way that this tiny thing is taking on all of that and making it through it. You would be fucked. The crew would almost certainly have been knocked out of the boat or taken on too much water and been eaten by the sea. Now, the only issue with the explosion theory is the lack of damage or scorch marks, and the generally decent state of the cargo when the ship was found. However, fortunately for us, we can be pretty certain that this is wrong, because that is what Solly Flood and all of those stupid fuckers said back in 1872. There's no scorch marks, so that means there was no explosion. It's the 21st century now, baby, and science, bitch, is much more gooder than before. And according to University College London, quote, 21st century scientific techniques have been used to finally solve the 19th century mystery. An experiment conducted by a scientist at UCL for a Channel 5 documentary shows that an explosion may indeed be the key to the fate of Captain Briggs, his family, and his crew. Dr. Andrea Seller built a replica of the hold of the Mary Celeste. Using butane gas, he simulated an explosion caused by alcohol leaking from the ship's cargo. Instead of barrels, he used cubes of paper. Setting light to the gas caused a huge blast, which sent a ball of flame upwards. Surely, the paper cubes would be burned or blackened, or the replica hold damaged. Remarkably, neither happened. Dr. Seller said, quote, "What we created was a pressure wave type of explosion. There was a spectacular wave of flame, but behind it was relatively cool air. No soot was left behind and there was no burning or scorching. Given all the facts we have, this replicates conditions on board the Mary Celeste. The explosion would have been enough to blow open the hatches and would have been completely terrifying for everyone on board. Such a massive explosion could have been triggered by a spark caused when two loose barrels rubbed together, or when a careless crewman, pipe in mouth, opened a hatch to ventilate the hold. Records show that 300 gallons of alcohol had leaked, more than enough to create a terrifying explosion." Dr. Seller said, quote, "It is the most compelling explanation of all those suggested. It fits the facts best and explains why they were so keen to get off the ship." Well, I'm kind of disappointed now, to be honest. I was kind of hoping it was Pennywise. Anyway, that seems to be the best explanation here. So perhaps a combination of Theory 9 and 10 could have caused this. Rough seas causing the cargo to leak, then the barrels rubbed together to create a fireball, and then just bad fucking luck for the crew in the yawl. Well, it is just a theory, but it has been replicated, so it's a pretty damn good explanation. Anyways, let me know what you guys think. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below, like the video, subscribe for more bullshit from the Mystorian, and I'll see you guys again soon with another mystery. Thanks for watching.
But why is the rum gone?